Welcome to the Owner to Owner podcast. I'm Michael Kerr, your host, and I'm also the founder of Kerr Capital, where for 22 years now I've worked alongside business owners. Owner to Owner is a business podcast to empower the owners of Australia's small and medium enterprises. Forget the slick stories of tech titans and unicorns. At Owner to Owner we get raw and we get real. Every Owner to Owner episode is a personal conversation with another business owner just like you. We explore the everyday struggles they face and the different pathways they tread to success. Practical advice and plenty of one percenters for better returns, less stress and more enjoyment. You'll find grit, laughs, maybe a few tears and some hard-won lessons only available from others who've been where you are, whatever your stage of ownership. Every owner has a compelling story to share. So join us to listen and to learn. Australia is facing a looming small business succession challenge. Each year in the next decade, thousands of small business owners employing tens of thousands of employees will be asking a very similar question. Who's taking over when I'm ready to step away? Selling to a competitor or on the market is familiar options, but what about selling to employees? Employment ownership trusts, EOTs, have made, and employee ownership more broadly, have made significant traction overseas, particularly in the UK. Yet here in Australia, on the EOT front, I think it feels to me like we're still behind. So we want to talk about, are EOTs and employee ownership more broadly a genuine solution for Australia's SME succession challenge? How far down the pathway are we until it becomes mainstream? To explore these questions, I want to welcome in Andrew Clements, co-chair of Employee Ownership Australia. Welcome in, Andrew.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for the opportunity to talk.
Let's get underway with. We chatted. It's almost 5 years ago on a previous iteration. So if you hadn't listened to that or haven't been following employee ownership, what's changed most in the last since that time of 5 or 6 years ago, if anything?
I think, Michael, it's a good news, bad news moment. I mean, what hasn't changed? What hasn't changed is largely the structural underpinnings that afford access to employee ownership. So that structural underpinning has largely not changed. I think what has changed is probably...
By structural, you mean the legislation?
Yeah, the sort of legislative underpinnings through both the corporations law and the tax law. I think the part that has changed is, and this is driven largely through the UK experience, but now the experience in other jurisdictions where we've seen employee ownership trusts, obviously in the UK, being very, very successful, but also we've seen them being adopted in Canada, and we're seeing them now being examined in a lot of detail in places like Ireland. So there's a lot of awareness around an employee ownership trust as one form of succession option. And I think that awareness has generated a discussion, certainly amongst small business owners looking to understand what options they have to them. And I think the key to that is the employee ownership trust is one version of dealing with employee ownership within a small business. It doesn't have to be the only one, but it is certainly one. There are other versions, but I think greater awareness of the issue and more focus on the issue. The part, I think, again, that hasn't changed, unfortunately, is we haven't had, in the same way as Canada did, an awakening within government to see that employee ownership is a key driver to generating both small business succession, but also the flip side of small business succession is access of younger Australians into ownership of small business. So that is not a theme that we've seen developed, and it's something that we've been pushing very, very strongly for some time.
Yeah, I mean, we've had an upheaval in where things might head for trust in the last budget. So we don't. I'm sure that will get worked through, but that's the most interesting thing here. We do have a lot of SMEs, and however they're going to be treated, the success in transitioning them is an opportunity for new owners, younger owners, to build a successful business and also to build wealth out of
Yes.
of a business as an employee.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's the thing that I'm seeing a lot of. And I guess the thing, Michael, that strikes me most is the strong cultural underpinnings of the organizations that we deal with. Yeah, most of them come to us saying we want to get our employees more engaged in the business, but it's almost in every case without structural elements to it. They've already got a high degree of structure and focus of engaging their employees in the business. What they don't have is a mechanism and process for facilitating both the generational change, because in many cases, this is not just generational change, it's mature businesses that see an opportunity to get their employees more involved in the business, to make the business more vibrant, more productive. So, as much as I kind of alluded to business succession, there's a lot of business transition and using employee ownership as a growth opportunity, not simply as a transition opportunity.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's true. And partial ownership of businesses, having a blend of age of owners, founders staying in for a lot longer as a minority shareholder. These are all things that are incredibly valuable because the challenge of selling a whole business when you're ready is, when you're ready is incredibly difficult. You can't borrow. It's very hard for anyone to borrow for it. The appetite to borrow to buy into a business is not high when you're carrying a mortgage and yeah. So no, I hear what you're saying.
It is, Michael,
Just
just to pick up on that, there's a compounding effect, obviously, in all, around the very topical issue of housing, because we're looking at a younger generation of worker with a strong focus on getting access to the housing market, which then creates real competition for them. And when saying, well, you have an opportunity to quote buy into this business, they've got very competing goals, and even with the best desire, may not be able to accommodate it in a traditional financing sense.
Yep. I've seen that many times where the stranglehold that the mortgage has on the psyche and the balance sheet and the finances of a family, very understandable. But it's the home, and
Yes.
to then go and try to borrow more against it or put the house up against the business it's not for a lot of people.
Mm, mm.
With employee ownership, look, we're going to get into employee ownership trusts in some more detail, but when we talk about employee ownership, it's there's a lot to it. There's 4 or 5 or 6 models that I've seen that. So we are going to focus on employee ownership trust, but there are other employee share schemes and that it seem to have maybe have they been more successful with larger businesses where you've got a big spread of employee shareholders, or
I
have you
think I
seen
think
them?
I think different. I think it's really important when we talk about employee ownership to understand that there's not one version of it. And it particularly in employee in EOA, we're very focused on looking at the different sectors of employee ownership. Clearly, there are listed companies that are looking at broad-based employee ownership through $1,000 exemption plans and executive ownership, and again, large corporations who have Australian subsidiaries who are looking to offer into Australia to provide their employees with a wealth creation opportunity in alignment with the business. And then you move to the very topical areas at the moment of startups, where ostensibly you're looking largely at enterprises that are cash strapped, perhaps being more colourful. They're selling the dream. The dream is this is going to be vastly successful, and you can have part of the equity at day one. And indeed, there's a specific regime for the startup regime. So they're very discrete sectors. When you move away from those sectors and you move into employee ownership more generally, and in the listed, so in the unlisted category, and unlisted obviously can be very, very large or sort of medium or very, very small, but there are ostensibly two bookends. The two bookends are this: allocated plans, where particular employees are allocated a particular number of shares and become a shareholder and a holder of a particular number of shares. That is very much the traditional version of employee ownership, and may or may not involve funding from an external funder. In most cases, it doesn't. In most cases, it's providing a small number of employees with an allocated number of securities to take the benefit of the equity return and potentially receive some upside if there's a future liquidity event. But that's very much framed around the return being equity return whilst you're there, potential for some upside, and potential engagement in management. The challenge of those schemes is they can work very, very well. The challenge of them is the word allocated, because there's a fixed number of shares. When someone leaves, you need to create a market. You may not want your former employees to still hold shares in you. You need to create a market. You need to create a price. You need to create an exit mechanism. And all of those things create structure and complexity. It's one of the core reasons why, in the traditional sense, the allocated plans are there, but are not as broadly used as they might be, because it's either, Michael, you must fund as the employee, or the company must fund, and we need a structure for your exit. So that's the traditional version of it in small business. The EOT is different in a sense because, and the key element, the key word that I think it makes it different is unallocated. It's an unallocated plan. So what you have is an equity stake being held for a group of employees, all of the employees, or a group of the employees collectively. So no individual employee has a particular number of shares. That then gives the flexibility that you don't then need some of these issues around creating the market when you leave. It perhaps takes a little more emphasis around that point of, one of the three elements of doing this is equity, reward, engagement in management, and an opportunity on a liquidity event. It kind of takes the liquidity event a little bit out of it, but it then provides a lot more flexibility to engage and bring employees in to the organisation, but without them having the funding obligation. So it's that dichotomy between allocated and unallocated, which I think
Yeah.
is where
Yeah, no, thank you for clearing that up. With where we are currently in Australia, the way I see it, we have very set, well-established asset classes for investment, managed investment shares and superannuation and housing, and it absolutely dominates the balance sheet of the average Australian family. And the one thing that I come back to this in a lot of the episodes of this podcast is business equity sits down below furniture and flat screens and fridges in the wealth of the Australian average family. We have, by employees, we have the 1 million employing small businesses there's 2.6 million small businesses, 1.6 don't employ anybody. They're zero employees. They're just the founder. But there's another million. Overall, that group has 5 million employees. You come to the other end of the spectrum, 5,000 large businesses, more than 200, employ close enough to 5 million employees. So there's no succession or transition issues in the large corporates. There's real and genuine succession and transition issues with those million employing businesses that account for maybe 4 or 5 million employees. So do we have in the discussions you have, the advocacy you do, is there hope for small business as a genuine asset class with employee ownership, EOTs facilitating that?
I'm a huge optimist. I think the answer has to be yes. And I think it has to be yes, Michael, simply because it's a structure that we've seen work globally, and we've seen it work globally. There is nothing different in the Australian market that says it should not, could not, and would not be effective in our market. So my optimism is that the strength and logic of those arguments will ultimately take hold, and there will be engaging or emerging pressure as people begin to see and understand the problems of succession, and that dichotomy of the founder who's been vastly successful in their own unique business style, and that unique business style has been different from the mainstream, and they're desperate to hang on to it, and that's been the thing that's made them successful. And for so many founders, it's not about eking out the last dollar out of the business transition process. It's about accommodating a method or methodology to provide their business, their employees, and their way of doing business a way into the future. And that's the thing that actually strikes me most about when I speak to so many founders. This is not about how do I eke out the last dollar on an exit.
Yeah, it's a theme that comes up all the time. It's you hear about the gazillionaires that start and skyrocket and create, but there's a lot of other startups, businesses, founders that are about just a lot more than just the end valuation. I mean, it's something they focus on, but it's there's always more to it than things like legacy come into it. Things like staff, things
Yes.
like community, they often come into that. So you talked about the UK, Canada, I think Slovenia, or Ireland. What's Are they doing anything? Do they have a different view of their economy than we do here in Australia that kind of has perhaps slowed our progress towards an EOT that's
Yeah, it's a great question, and one I wish I knew the answer to. I think in a sense, there's a little bit of history in terms of small business and employee ownership that unfortunately in the late 90s, early 2000s, employee ownership had become or was used, or mechanisms that were used under the heading of employee ownership were largely mechanisms to improve tax or the return for founders. That has had a long standing impact. It's had an impact in the sense that our rules carry that mindset. Okay, the
it's a tax dodge.
it's a tax dodge. And, my mantra and EOA's mantra in relation to employee ownership is promote, not prevent. So much of what is built into the DNA of our tax and regulatory regime are those historical elements of employee ownership, and they're well covered, they're well protected. And I mean, the one message that I keep making as clear as I can is employee ownership is not about some sort of tax arrangement or tax scheme to get a tax benefit. If that's something that people are desperately looking for, they're in the wrong place.
They'll find other ways to
Yeah, yeah.
shift.
It is not, and it can't be driven by things that put tax integrity at risk. I mean, what is success? Success for me and our organisation is that conventional employee ownership structures are common or garden. They're taken off the shelf and used in a very, very simple, accessible way. Michael, I will say, no one should ever have to talk to me about employee ownership, because if they're talking to me about it, you know, they've reached the wrong place. This must be accessible to everyone and easily understood by everyone and easily understood by all advisors, which takes you a little bit to the mindset piece. What is it? What is it that brought the success of that regime in the UK and Canada? We spent a lot of time talking to Graham Nuttall, who was engaged in that process. Employee ownership trusts were in existence prior to the regime being introduced in the UK. It was not so much the concessions, but a regime that recognised them, that brought them then to this is something which I, as an advisor to small business, need to take into account, understand, and consider. And it's that mindset change where it's a common version, something you do and it's understood and promoted, is where it happens. So it's about, for me, it's about developing a recognition of this as a common, simple, easily accessible structure.
Yeah, on both sides. I mean, we have there's a perhaps call it a blockage in terms of why or how employee ownership's been used in the past, and we were chatting just a little before we started about this. There's opportunities for younger business owners, younger families, younger startup founders, buyers of established businesses to to diversify their wealth. You do that on some scale, and we kind of stabilize the SME share of the economy because it's overwhelmingly dominated by big business and government, and that's the kind of the
It
threat.
takes you, Michael, to your point about the engagement and the involvement of or employment within small business. I mean, it is a large sector of our community, our business community, and I mean, the support of it the need for the support of it is clear. And unfortunately, I mean, I guess, our tax system doesn't help. We need a simple business structure that people can use and operate with certainty and engage and properly reward their employees.
Yeah, and not and as you say, not have to talk to you or
Yeah, no one should talk to me.
yeah. So if we did were able to adopt an EOT in the style of the UK or Slovenia or Ireland or Canada, what would it do you think there'd be a dramatic change soon after that? Or is there still
I
gonna
think
be a
so. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. We at EOA, we've worked with a number of that basically a series of founders who are looking to transition using an employee ownership trust. They are determined and very focused. We largely can get there, but the road we get there is a little less direct, firstly, and secondly, a little more complicated. Neither of those things are good. If there were a simple recognized version of what an employee ownership trust is and can be, one of the things at EOA that we were promoting very strongly was trying to get ATO guidance around some of the core issues that were associated with employee ownership trusts. And as part of that, we developed and put to the tax office a complete package of documents that you would use to establish an employee ownership trust with the aim that they would be matters of public record and people would then use and operate those documents and structures within a form of assurance from the tax office in relation to those particular issues. Unfortunately, we weren't successful in relation to that, and our lack of success was, in a sense, challenging because the feedback that we got was, well, there's not enough demand, but there won't be demand until the product's well known. And in a sense, what we tried to do through work with the ATO was to get that recognition of demand, which is why, Michael, in a sense, I think ultimately, and the Canadian experience shows this, is that ultimately a form of legislative recognition of the structure is critical to the process. It
yeah.
doesn't have to be, and this is, I think, it doesn't have to be legislative recognition with lots and lots and lots of concessions attached to it. There are some, not concessions, there are some elements that we would, in terms of advocacy, we would be suggesting to government need to be coordinated to make sure that a scheme that's got appropriate integrity and legislative requirement around it should be afforded particular safe harbours around access to some of the tax parts of the tax regime. And by safe harbours, all we're really asking for is the same result that you would have had if you sold to a third party. The same
Yeah.
result you would have
Yeah.
had if you sold to a third party. So
Yeah,
nothing,
which is
yeah, not
which
not not driven by the guise of concession.
yeah, yeah. But the instability of small bit a lot of those businesses will not sell,
Mm,
and
yes.
employees might well be the last and most logical buyer
Mm,
and have a sense of control. You see it out the further you go out of the big cities, the more important these everyday businesses are to that community. They're not going to be the target of a private equity offer because they're local businesses serving a local community, but they're vitally important. So this idea or notion that there's not a lot of demand, I mean, it's hidden, it's there, and you see it in the rise of other alternative ownership models, community ownership.
yes. Yep.
Matt Farlett came on last week to talk, a couple of weeks ago, to talk about community-owned assets and cooperatives and mutuals and social enterprises, different ways of stabilising that base of small businesses, especially in smaller communities. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean,
Just to
it's
to pick up
a
on
wake-up call.
Yeah, to pick up on that, actually, it's a really interesting observation around the impact on in rural Australia of these structures. My mindset, Michael, when I first came to this was very much around this was about business succession. And that is true to a point. The bit that actually struck me is, and we've seen this now through a series of organisations where it's actually not so much about succession as building a community and building a business community. And there's a very good example in dental, in a dental practice, which is, rather than the traditional version of a dental practice as I develop, I sell just before I retire. This is a dental practice where the founder is very focused on engaging and bringing everyone in and building it as a sustainable dental practice. Now,
Yeah,
that
Monica
she
O'Malley from
yeah,
Your New,
yeah,
and she's coming up in the next episode of Owner to Owner because
yeah,
she's a founder who, despite all of the, she was determined to make her business employee owned and did a lot of hard yards,
mm, mm.
used a lot of overseas examples as inspiration. But yeah, sorry, I
But
was just about.
it is a really good it's a really good example of the breadth of uh, employee involvement, engagement, and ownership as a means of sustaining and supporting a whole range of purposes, and which is all the more reason. I mean, I'm an advocate and an enthusiastic advocate, but it's the good sense of what I see that says, yeah, this makes sense.
Hi there, just a short interruption and a message from Kerr Capital. Kerr Capital specialise in advising business owners who want to get sale ready or, as is increasingly common, get approached out of the blue by a potential buyer. If this is you, I know there'll be plenty of big questions and a lot of uncertainty. We're expert at supporting owners in making significant personal and business decisions and then helping create a really strong plan of action. If you want to find out more, contact us at the Kerr Capital website and then we can book a 45-minute no obligation discovery call. Now let's head back to the podcast. But you and I have had a discussion recently with someone who it's a 10-person business, skilled services or high training services, and the profile of that business is like a lot of particularly service-based businesses where in a pool of 5 to 20 employees, they're the most logical buyer is somebody from in the firm.
Yes. Yep.
And it might be a pool, it might be 2 or 3 of them, and they might have a secondary scheme or employee ownership model that that is a portion of the shares for that to keep the employees there and make them keep them productive. They want to be productive. They just want to
Mm.
work in a
Yes.
business that's good to work in. So, but it's from I see it through the eyes of small business owners. Employee ownership, it's a conversation. It's the zeitgeist. It's being talked about. But it has layers of complexity and layers of uncertainty. I suppose,
Yeah, yeah, and
particularly as a
and it's
result.
interesting to pick up that services point. I mean, we get a lot of questions from architects, engineers who are, you know, f fit very clearly in that sort of dynamic that we've spoken about of a founder with a particular ethos, engaged employees, and a desire to create a future for those employees. So it and in a sense, it has the advantage of that they're largely not capital intensive, so that they don't have, I was going to say call it the distraction, but the competing needs of equity. Or finance to actually run and maintain the business, so they might need external finance to grow.
Yeah, yeah. They're But yeah, I think of that 1 million of employing businesses that the services, technical, professional, it's a very natural environment from which employee ownership of some model seems to make a lot of sense. And I've been seeing it for my work for years and years and years, 10 years. And the employees, a group of them, if not all of them, however you structured it's to be decided, but they're most natural buyer for the business, and sometimes they knock on the door of the owner. Sometimes the owner goes to them, and because you introduce a larger multinational as a potential buyer, and the owners it can be a very attractive offer. But if the staff fundamentally aren't incented don't like it, don't like the culture. Well, the value of the probability of selling, it's impacted. So so you keep the team together, and there's a lot of teams that I think what would like to stay together, and yeah. So
It's an interesting contrast in a sense that the 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 bookending those two versions or exit versions. If you look at it from the large buyout, almost by definition, the founder is locked into it because they're critical to the value transfer to the purchaser. So, in a sense, they're locked into it as part of a value transfer. The interesting part of the founder from the other end of the spectrum is, and they're not locked into it, but they're engaged in it in a very different way as part of a transition and the ongoing success of the business. And it's a very different dynamic. And I think that's one of the things that I've noticed about founders when they're looking at that exit mechanism about what they want to do in the next part of their working career. And that influences, I think, a lot of the process of, you know, I don't want to be locked in for a fixed period to basically for a value transfer to the purchaser.
yeah, well, it's really, it can be an attractive headline number in an offer, but if you got to stay there for 5 years to earn, through the earn-out period, and it turns out it's very easy to do the analysis with your advisors on the numbers, but I do you don't want to work in a I'll won't use the French here, but you want to work with people in an environment that you're happy, particularly at the end of, you've been there for 30 years as the founder, the leader, the driver of the business, and you go into a hierarchy and you're working with a bunch of people. You go, geez, I might, I don't know if I'll get through this. Money might be all right if I get there, but to see out your last few years in that kind of environments, it's a horror story for some. And versus with planning, because a lot of the effectiveness of employee ownership trust, as I see it, is that it's not we're going to sell tomorrow. You're going to sell that over a number of years that's paced to what the business can afford to
Yes.
take out and give you. But you don't get it mostly in one hit. You get it over 5 years, and it probably makes sense to have an ongoing involvement if it's structured so everyone knows they used to be the 100% owner.
Mm.
Now they're a reducing owner. Their role is as an employee is very clear. The governance is clear. So yeah, it all requires planning, but it's in theory, I think a better way out for a lot of
Yeah.
owners.
What you've hit on there, Michael, is one of the great challenges in terms of managing the conundrum of financing the exit, the period of the exit, providing certainty to the founder regarding, the funding and they're going to receive their exit payment. And this is one of the areas where there is a tension under the existing tax rules that they don't give us the flexibility that I would like to be able to accommodate, that you can accord or exit over a period of time in a staged way without accelerating a tax event and not exposing yourself to credit risk. I think the analogy I used was a sort of crooked road with some distractions. That essence of whether it's 100% sale in installments or a stage sell down is part of that crooked road.
Yeah, yeah. But I get the impression that where we are at a national policy level is there's this overhang of it being it's complicated, it's tricky, but so is selling a business, and if you vendor finance it but the opportunity for the next generation of business owners that we need to take over these businesses, and they need it's a big step up from being an employee, even a senior high performing employee, to being an owner. But we can work on that. But without that, the SME base net shrinks,
Yes.
and
Yep.
we it's a smaller percentage of the economy, and that's just not healthy.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it's interesting that to pick up on that, the experience that we have seen across quite a number of these transitions is a really important question is working with the employees and the founder working with the employees so that they understand what it is that they're being offered, what the benefits are for them, and in a sense, what the obligations are for them. And you alluded to it, Michael, but it's not for everyone. You know, there will be people, and that's not a criticism of them, we're all different, that stepping up into that different role is not one that they're comfortable with or they want to be involved in. Which is why I think it's so important when you do get enterprises where you've got people who are willing, are capable of stepping up, that we've got a mechanism and structure that facilitates their transition into being owners.
Yeah. Like you, I'm an optimist, but if you go right back to school and to universities and pathways and the dominance of managed investments in the balance sheet of the average Australian family, where we could go way back to that and tradies, electricians, plumbers coming out of their apprenticeship, locking in some more training on what it's like to work in a small business, some aspiration about why shouldn't you be an owner or a part owner of a business? I mean, that kind of we had, there's employer and employee. So it seems a pretty big divide. And there are people who are naturally who would go out there and make it happen, and God bless, right, for that. But there's a lot of others that it won't be, but there's going to be some, maybe a significant number, who would be that where employee ownership can really have a dramatic impact, because they don't necessarily have to be the 100% owner of the business. They could work with the team that's already there that they've been working with.
Yes.
So.
Yeah. I mean, I it is actually it's one of the elements of the sort of, well, it sounds like the voice when I say this, but the employee ownership journey. Yeah, because part of that journey is to understand the structure and what are the mechanics of doing it. The next part of that journey is to understand the finances of the business, of what are the finances, what's the free cash flow that can actually fund the reward to the founder, a proper reward to employees, and the economic growth of the business. And then there is the process of the engagement and structural transition, which is so important. We can create the legal form of that, but what's most important is finding the people who are willing, engaged, and capable of taking the business forward.
Yeah, yeah,
And there always seems to be one. There are in every organisation I speak to, there's always an ex of they're the natural leader, which in a sense, Michael, takes you to the conversation that today has been. We've bookended it in terms of allocated versus employee ownership trusts at the other end. In many instances, the best solution's a combination. You know, the best solution is something that might look like an unallocated plan for the bulk of the employees, but an equity allocation for the key employees who, in a sense, step in and become the next generation founder.
yeah,
So, it's an amalgam of both systems.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And perhaps a bit more of a focus on people. Monica O'Malley and her business. She, as I said, coming up in I think the next episode, and she was driven by a range of personal and business values, and got it done, and it can be done.
Yes.
Um,
Would I've worked, Monica, I love working with, but is a true force of nature.
she is indeed. All right.
It's interesting we talk about the benefits, and we've spoken a little bit about the sort of, the employees, if I can call them, at the top end of the structure, are the ones that, are taking over and making a difference. There's always the anecdote that actually stays with you, Michael, and the anecdote that stayed with me with one small business was someone in their warehouse, after they went through the process, came to them and said, "Do you realize how much stock we waste because we do A, B, C, and D?" And their focus as an owner changed their perspective and meant they were much more driven to actually bring that forward, and it made a difference. And it's all those small changes making a difference. So, it's the organizational change across the whole of the organization where everyone's working, for one business with one success.
Yeah. I mean, we've heard about, productivity at a national level. At a small business level, the biggest cost, the biggest influence on the success, all close enough to the most important influence on success is your staff. Because in most businesses, it's about it's a bit, it's 60% of your operating expenses are wages, or 20% is rent, or 10% is rent. But get more out of your people, because, like that example, and it doesn't have to be, but if they're all engaged, they can see a link between what they do and a better, more stable business, more enjoyable workplace, maybe a cut of the booty in the form of a dividend. Well, it's there in a lot of businesses, and you can go through your expenses line by line, but get more out of your people, e.g., well, that is productivity. It's a hell of a leg up for most businesses, and employers often don't do that very well. They're founders and owners that like doing things their way, but employees also, there's more they can do,
Mm,
more we can do to support them.
yeah, yeah. I mean, one of the things that's kind of occurred to me as, and I don't know the answer to this, and there'll be much cleverer people than I are thinking about it, is what, you know, the AI changes mean to small business, and whether in fact they will actually accommodate growth in small business, because it will mean that small businesses can do more and expand and do more things that they weren't able to do before, because there were genuine barriers they needed to be much larger to access and do bigger things. I mean, at one level, I wonder whether there's a convergence of, a change in the nature of work and a change in the nature of way business is going to be managed, that means that they don't necessarily operate through the larger constructs that we have at the moment, as those
Yeah.
as the larger structures are broken down.
And leaping right ahead here, there must be, as a part of that, the opportunities, I think, are incredibly significant. And it seems like if you're a zero employee business and you can use AI effectively, you can do some really potent things. It's not easy to just pick up AI and embed it in a business, but let's assume for the people doing that are already employed somewhere, aren't quite getting out of it, or feel like they're missing out. So you can do that with a small business. Same motivation. Either I don't feel like I'm getting a fair share, or I don't enjoy it, so I'll go do my own thing. We have this lot of small businesses that are got all sorts of potential and all sorts of importance for communities and particular local economies. So yeah,
Yes.
some people buy into that. All right. I think I was going to get into the mechanics of an employee ownership trust, but I think we kind of I think we already really talked about that. Do you want to just give us an overview of the types of businesses that you think are better suited to employee ownership and EOTs
Yeah,
more broadly?
it's interesting. I think the one thing I can say, that of all, as I said before, of all of the enterprises that have come to us and spoken about it, the one thing they've all had in common is a strong engagement with their employees already. So this wasn't a moment of, you know, this wasn't sort of a light bulb moment that said, "Oh, look, if we had strong engagement with our employees, things might change." They were organizations that had that engagement and involvement and were wanting to develop it further. So that has been the strongest theme and thread between all of the enterprises. I think I alluded to it before, those that have got less capital assets are more easily accommodated. So the consulting firms where there's not large capital structure is easier. Those that are, perhaps service related, outside sort of white collar services, are more easily accommodated. Where sometimes we get more challenges is where there are significant hard assets. And the obvious examples, the obvious regional examples of that is farming, where it's a small business, but it's a small business run from a very large single asset. So the instances where we found challenges and you can work them through, but you need to disaggregate the operation and management of the enterprise, being the farm or the business, from the asset itself. And it may well be that there isn't a funding mechanism that can facilitate the employees buying the principal asset, but by disaggregating the business that's run and the asset, you can make it work. So
Yeah.
to answer your question in reverse, the ones that have been most difficult and most challenging is where there are large hard assets
Yeah.
that aren't easily capable of transfer.
But the one thing about that is that financiers understand that well. So
Yes,
again,
yes,
combinations in an employee-owned business could be purely an employee ownership trust. It could be that plus a combination of other things, plus a financier but
yes. Yeah,
you've got to understand your numbers, and the numbers have got to,
Michael, that's a great
got to be
observation because
sustainable.
that was that. So if you work through that dynamic, you know, one of the principal projects that we're working on where that's been a challenge, there was an industry group that had a particular interest in that form of infrastructure that was a potential investor, so that it would then be the owner of the infrastructure take a reward from that infrastructure, and then but independently have a group of employees in a different entity run the business, so that we'd segregated the infrastructure from the asset. So not only just in a traditional financing sense of having someone coming in and financing the exit, actually having someone who had a particular expertise or interest in that asset class, saying, we want to be involved in that asset class and we'll hold that asset class. But they didn't then want to run the business. So I think that to me is the interesting micro economy that should develop out of this is that as we see more refined analysis of some of these structures, we might see then the division of the structural asset, the infrastructure asset from the business.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a very rational MBA, kind of approach to, where's our capital, financial and other best spent. And yeah, so partnerships, they're an understanding of, it shouldn't prohibit, right? But the one of those opportunities moving forward, it might need a more advanced structure to,
Yeah,
to help.
and that's
But the
yeah, and that,
and
I
those
think
the trade-off is, if you own property,
mm,
if we're talking about machinery and equipment, that's a different thing. But when we're talking about property, there's that constant
mm,
in the back of your mind for owners of the real estate, much easier to flip piece of prime real estate and for an alternative use, and that's a real
yeah. I mean,
challenge.
the areas particularly regional, or the sectors that are particularly regional, that this has been looked at and talked at a lot, is around aged care and childcare. And we as an organisation spent quite a lot of time making submissions to the New South Wales Childcare inquiry around, particularly in regional Australia, how we could get sustainable childcare and aged care structures by engaging in employees so that the existing structure could be maintained.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
yeah,
I mean,
I
they've
mean,
been through some turbulence
yes.
the last 20 years, and so yeah, that's been some pretty awful outcomes.
Yeah, but it's. I mean, in a sense, we've had less success in advocacy in those areas, and I don't think that's because they're the wrong areas. I think it's to your point, Michael, that they're more complex. They're more complex regimes. They're more complex issues that are being faced beyond the simple transition issue that I'm
Yeah,
focusing on
yeah.
today.
Just, I know, conscious time. Demand, you mentioned that that's if we could increase demand, we might have some more, there might be some more visibility around that. So is the demand area, or big,
I've got
small, medium?
I've got no doubt the demand exists. I've got no doubt the demand exists. It's a supply issue. It's a supply which is complexity constrained. So some of the supply at the moment has more complexity with it than we want. So it limits the number of people. The other constraining element, which is a great concern to me, is we don't have in Australia at the moment a bank of professionals, both lawyers, stroke accountants, with an interest and focus on the development of this area. And I think it's a chicken and egg moment. We will get it. We will get it if there was a recognition of it, but you know, we must get it to a point where for all advisors, they need to talk about, in the same way as I'll talk about the small business tax concessions if you're selling, they should talk about employee ownership as an alternative option as just part of their normal conversation.
Yeah, they should. Someone like Monica we chatted about this. She drove her accountant and lawyer. They were on board, but there's, a lot of advisors are quite rightly engaged and specialised in helping minimise tax or, increase the structure. So, but that I think some of that has got to come back to, and you made the point earlier, to owners that are, this is I want to drive this. And it should be more obvious if just generally exit planning isn't done, succession planning isn't done particularly well or particularly early. There's been an industry called exit planning for a long time now, and it's does some great work, but it's, I think, with owners that are very mission driven to have an exit event at the highest value in 5 years' time. Fantastic. But is there another layer of advisors and professionals and owners who say, well, that's, by the way, you can't guarantee that exit, but i- another layer of advisors and owners who kind of look beyond the exit event to, to a transition event that has ripple effects through other areas outside of the owner's bank account, the community, the employees, and so on. So, yeah, but a ways to go. I want to thank you in advance, but I do want to close with my favourite question about two questions. The first one is, you're the owner of a profitable, sustainable You're hoping to retire in 5 years' time. What would you be telling them to do today in advance of them leaving their business on their terms?
I think part of it's entirely non-legal, but
Yeah.
I think the first part is it's probably three things. Understand what it is that you want out of this. Secondly, how long and how much do you want to stay involved in it? And thirdly, I think, which is the most important point, is looking at and working with your workforce now to identify the leaders who can take that business forward, rather than not identify. And it's not just identify, give them authority and scope to grow and understand the business so that there is a natural transition rather than I'm leaving now and now I'll start to transition. So I think the number one thing is early engagement with the workforce and the senior workforce who understand the business as to what the future might hold.
You managed that. That was an excellent answer, and there was not one bit of legal advice in it. So well done. It was just the kind of high level. What do you want, and when do you want it, and like, if it's going to be your team of employees, well, you let's have a chat. So, or get a chat started. So nothing about structures or tax. Good on you. All right, just on the final question, Andrew. You've been, I imagine you've certainly been advocating and agitating it. But if they plucked you to run Australia's federal small business department, and you arrive next Monday, seat feet under the cabinet table, what are the things you would do or direct be done straight away to shore up our SME economy?
I mean, I think, and there's an obvious political element or all of this. I think the one thing, and we've spoken about today, is to create robust succession models that are identifiable, understandable, a strong focus around removing complexity, because I look at so much of what, in my world as a tax person, I have to manage. It's the level of complexity that people shouldn't have to talk to tax people. You know, eh, we should have a world where our structure is simple enough and principles based enough that if you're largely doing the right thing, it doesn't go wrong. My great conundrum in dealing with small business is so often in my world, they haven't done anything that's wrong, but their lack of understanding of some of the levels of sophistication that exist about the regulation, and particularly the tax regulation that operates for them, is so high that they get caught. And then they get strangled by the complexity. So, because I'm a tax person, I would always look at it in terms of the simplicity of the tax regulation that they have to operate in, and a large element of that simplicity has to be the structural simplicity of operating within a particular form, so that that structure can operate simply and easily and does not have too many combinations and permutations that mean that you can get tripped over.
Yeah. No, that's excellent. Thank you, Andrew. Yeah. Reducing complexity and increasing understanding and awareness is, it's definitely a bit of a longer term project, but I think we both agreed optimists. So carry on. Thank you so much for taking time to come on to the Owner to Owner podcast, Andrew.
No, pleasure. It's great to chat and also great to sort of share thoughts. And if any of the listeners have got interest in the sort of things that we've been talking about, to use that wonderful millennial expression I get in trouble using, please reach out to EOA, and we'd be very happy to talk to you.
Yeah. So EOA is Employee Ownership Australia.
Yep.
And
I should say that if you could, Employee Ownership Australia is an advocacy group, no more. We are not a group that provides sort of, if I call it, services in setting up, doing. We're an advocacy group, and our role is to facilitate employee ownership, and that's that's what we're most focused on. So it's as an advocate.
yeah. And are there any other resources that you, and we don't have to nail it right now, but if there are, we could, any that come to mind, shout them out, or otherwise we'll just put some notes into the.
Yeah, no, very happy. I'll come back to you, Michael, because
Okay.
there's
Okay.
some other material.
All right, Andrew. Much
No, great.
appreciate
Thank
your
you.
time. Go well.
Great speaking with you. See you soon.
So thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Owner to Owner and got some helpful advice and maybe some more clarity on how to make your business work better for you. To subscribe or to listen back or to access any of the resources or information we talked about in this episode, head over to the website owner2ownerpodcast.com.au, or you can search up Owner to Owner podcast on your favourite pod player. If this episode or the podcast generally is really helpful, I'd love it if you could leave me a like, a rating or a review, but even more than that, I'd love it if you could share it with another business owner. There's a new episode out every couple of weeks. I'll catch you then.